So what I had planned on doing before sending the article out, so that may have changed what I had planned on doing, but what I had planned on doing was to continue talking about David and his relationship to the Psalter. We were almost done with that. If you have the large outline on page 3, we were at the very last point at the top of page 3, which was B2, Hebrews 4:7, the phrase in David. So I wanted to talk about that. And then I wanted to look at Psalm 137 and talk about that. And I also thought I would try to leave some time to talk about the article if there was something in there that anybody thought. I don't want to get off into a discussion of politics or riots or racism or any of that. I would like, my sole interest in that article is how he uses Psalm 137. That's the only thing I'm interested in. And so I wanted, if there was something about that that you thought was helpful in the interpretation of Psalm 137 or was thought-provoking, then I'm totally, I think that would be appropriate to talk about. But the other topics that are related to that really don't fall into the study that I wanted to do. So is that okay with everybody?
Yeah, agree with me.
All right. Okay, we're good. So let's start by looking at the phrase in David. So if you go to Hebrews 4:7, and I wonder how many different translations we have tonight. I've got the NIV. Who's got something different?
I've got New King James.
New King James, okay. Steve, you have
got
an
BSB.
Yeah, ESV, okay.
BSB.
BSB.
Berean.
Okay. Gary, what do you got tonight?
I have an NIV.
NIV. Okay, so he's reverted back to the flaming NIV, right?
I can't find my Holman. It's.
Oh no. Oh no.
Sooner or later, I'll rescue it. I know, unless somebody got away with it, which didn't happen.
I think Dante said there was a special circle in hell for people who lose their Bible. I'm not sure.
I'll work on it real hard. Yeah, I didn't find my Holman. I prefer it.
Yeah, the Holman is very good. I like it too.
You recommended it to me.
Yeah. So my NIV in Hebrews 4, we're going to look at verses maybe 6 and 7. So 6, it says, "It still remains that some will enter that rest, and those who formerly had the gospel preached to them did not go in because of their disobedience." Verse 7, "Therefore God again set a certain day, calling it today, when a long time later he spoke through David, as was said before, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts." Does anybody have a different word other than through David?
In David.
Okay, New King James, in David. Anybody else? Okay, so the word there has been translated both ways, through and in. And if you go to like Bible Gateway or Bible Hub and look at all the different translations, you'll see that it's in and through, and I think there might even be one other way that it's been translated.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I was
no.
trying to get my versions selected on my screen, the two side by sides. Which verse specifically are you referring to?
4:7.
7. Okay.
Right.
All right.
So the phrase in David or through David. So it's interesting. The psalm that's being quoted here is Psalm 95. That psalm in the Psalter is anonymous. And there are some examples of anonymous psalms being attributed to David. Psalm 2 is anonymous, but in Acts 2, Peter quotes it and said, "As David said." It's a different phrase, "as David said." And then he quotes it. And so then we count that as a psalm written by David. But this one here, especially in the versions that say in David, like the New King James, several interpreters and commentators, not just a handful, but over the years, a large group of them, including really important translators and Greek grammarians and things like that, say that this in David indicates that the Psalter is being called David. That David is the name for the Psalter. That in the Psalms it says. And so this is really an interesting quotation, because it's the only place actually in the New Testament that would call call the book of Psalms just by the name David. Now, in Jewish tradition, that is acceptable and normal and all of that. But in the New Testament here, I think what we have here is an example of that. And so the translations where it says through David, or sometimes they even say spoke through David, and it sounds like they're saying David is the author of this particular psalm, which is, I don't think, what the author to the Hebrews is communicating. And did anybody have a chance to read any of the quotes about this? It's on page, they're on page 10 in your handout. Let's look at those. So just wanted to show this to you, just as a really, it's just an interesting revelatory type of thing.
I read these, but it was probably a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, so we'll go through them again. Do you want to read the first one there from F.F. Bruce?
Oh, sorry. I was on page 7.
Yeah, page 10.
Page 10. Okay. So Psalm 95 is anonymous in the
Masoretic.
Masoretic text, but the Septuagint assigns it to David. Our author's phrase, in David, verse 7, may mean simply in the Psalter. Whether he thought of David as the composer of this particular psalm or not is immaterial to his argument, which is that the wording of the psalm implies that entry into the rest of God is still available so long a time after the age of the Exodus and wilderness wanderings.
Thanks. So Bruce is kind of reserved here, but he says that it's possible that the author here to Hebrews just means the Psalter when he says David. And one of the reasons that Bruce would say that is not only grammatically would that be supported, but that because the fact that David may have written this psalm is not material to the argument. And so, as it would be when Jesus says, you know, as David said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. David is central to that argument.
But if he's saying that David is, whether or not you think it's David is immaterial, the question comes to my mind, well, why even bring it up then? If it's
well, his suggestion is that it probably or possibly means the Psalter, as it says in the book of Psalms, in David. So he's saying it's being brought up for that reason, not to identify the author, but to identify the place in Scripture.
well, why it might be there.
Yeah. So, Steve, can you read the quotation from Westcott? This is Bishop Westcott. He was a Greek grammarian, and he and Hort wrote the Westcott and Hort, or compiled the Greek text, which formed the basis of many of the translations, well, all of the English translations that came out up until, you know, probably the 40s or 50s. So for like 75 years. Steve, could you read that?
Sure. So this is Romanet 2, Westcott. And Westcott saying, David, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, I'm coming through my earbuds. David was regarded as the author of the whole Psalter. And he goes on, saying, in the person of David, who was regarded as the author of the whole Psalter, and not in the book of David, the expression which follows the common mode of speaking is not to be regarded by itself as decisive of the authorship of the psalm.
So this might need a little
Unpacking there?
yeah, elucidation, I guess would be the word.
Yes, I would say.
I'm not
So-
really sure what I read.
Okay, so one clarification on the handout, the right after the numerals where, like I said, Westcott colon, I'm just summarizing what Westcott said there, and then the quote is below that. So like in number 3, I say William Lane, comma, etc. The quote from William Lane starts below, I skip a line and then the quote starts. Sorry for the confusion there. So the two things here that he says. He says, he's quoting from Hebrews 4:7, saying in the person of David. The part in italics is the quote, saying in the person of David. He's quoting from Hebrews 4:7. And then he says, who was regarded as the author of the whole Psalter. I mean, he states it as, it's a fact, it's not in dispute. And he says, what the Hebrew author, what the writer to Hebrews wrote was saying in the person of David, not, quote, in the book of David. Then he says the expression saying in the person of David, that expression, which follows the common mode of speaking, he says this, we come across this a lot, is not to be regarded by itself as decisive of the authorship of the psalm. So what he's saying is when the author to the Hebrews writes saying in the person of David, that it's clear that David was regarded as the author of the whole Psalter. What's not clear is if the author here is saying that David wrote Psalm 95. So
I don't understand that at all. You said David is the author of the whole Psalter, but he's not the author of one of the Psalms.
right. David is regarded, that's the important word, regarded as the author of the whole Psalter. Not that he personally wrote every psalm, but that he is, that when, in other words, Westcott is saying that the phrase in the person of David, which the writer to the Hebrews uses, is equivalent to saying in the book of Psalms. Because David is a name that they would use for the Psalter. So he is considered in some sense to be the author of all of the Psalms, or at least the, I guess author might be an unfortunate choice there. And then he goes on to say that this is what the phrase means, that it's the Psalter. David is regarded as the author of all of the Psalms, the Psalter, the entire Psalter. But the writer of the Hebrews is not necessarily saying anything about Psalm 95 as far as being written by David himself. So I'll give you an example. I'll give you another example. So in Matthew, I think it's probably one of the early, like one of the very early quotes in Matthew. Matthew, let's see if I can find it. Okay, let me see if I can find it here. It's very early in Matthew where Matthew quotes something and he says, as it says in Jeremiah, and it's not Jeremiah that actually said it, it was another prophet. And so what the explanation is that in the Hebrew scripture, Jeremiah was the main book in this section. And so saying in Jeremiah is equivalent to saying in the books of which Jeremiah is the main one, which Jeremiah is the leading representative. And so you know, we wouldn't say, oh, Matthew got it wrong. That's not the book of Jeremiah. Another example where the text says in Elijah, and that would be in Romans 11:2, in Elijah. And Elijah didn't write any scripture, but it's the portion of scripture that deals with Elijah. So
You say about Elijah.
You could, but you can't say about David here in Hebrews 4:7, because the quotation from Psalm 95 is not about David. It's found somewhere. Where's it found? It's found in David. That's the point. Anyway, we'll go on, look at some more of the quotes, and then maybe it'll become less cloudy. In fact, I think I'm at the last quote here. So This is by William Lane, who wrote it's a recent and a very excellent, get a lot of great reviews, 2-volume commentary on the book of Hebrews. So he translates Hebrews 4:7 this way. This is how he translates it. God again appointed a certain day, saying in the Psalter, so much later, today, in the text already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. This is how he's translating the phrase in David. He translated it, instead of saying in David, he says saying in the Psalter. And then he has a footnote Q, which I've left in the quotation, and the footnote Q in part reads, the versatile preposition N, EV there, looks like it's N, here has a local sense in David, where David clearly has reference to the book of Psalms. So, so these authors and many others all throughout history, church history, have seen this reference as likely to be equating David, the name David, with the entire Psalter. And that is one of the reasons why, if you remember last week, I showed you all those translations of the Psalms that said the Psalms of David, the great harp of David's, David, the harp of David, the book of Psalms, and they equated the name David with the entirety of the Psalter, even though everybody was well aware that David did not write them all. So why is that important? I think it's important because one of the ways you can understand the Psalms is that they're the writings of David, or they're associated with David, and so David is speaking either as, so there was a quote, let me see if I can find it. Hopefully I've got it here. So I'll put this up on the screen and see if it'll take me a second. Let's see.
Oh, it's all confusing to me.
Oh, sorry, Don. I will try to make it better in just a second. I think this might help. If it doesn't, then I think it's not a point it's not that critical of a point. It's not critical at all. Well, it is helpful, but it's not critical. So can you guys see this slide?
Yes.
I can.
Yeah.
So this is from the ESV Global Study Bible. This is their introduction to the Psalms, author and date. Individual Psalms come from diverse periods of Israel's history, and so they have a timeline there where a lot of them come from. But at every stage, they served as the songbook of God's people. David wrote about half of the Psalms. His role as king was more than that of a ruler. This is important. He was to represent and even embody the people, and their well-being was tied to his faithfulness. David then writes as a representative, and the readers must discern whether the emphasis of a psalm is more on his role as ruler or more on his role as ideal Israelite, in which he is an example for all. The historical occasions mentioned in the psalm titles help the reader see how faith applies to real life situations. Okay, so David then writes as a representative, and the readers must discern whether the emphasis of a psalm is more on his role as ruler. So David writing as the anointed ruler of God's people, God's covenant people. So this is a type of Christ, the anointed ruler of God's covenant people. Or if he is writing more in his role as the ideal Israelite. Let me ask you, who is the ideal Israelite?
Jesus.
Jesus.
Yeah.
So both ways we get to Jesus. And the assumption that the assumption underlying all of this comment about David is that David, when you read the Psalms, you are looking for the speaker as king, the speaker as ideal Israelite, or it's about the king and the kingship, or it's about the ideal Israelite. And it doesn't matter actually if David wrote that particular psalm. And so So this is, you know, it's not a full-blown thing, but the point that they're making, and the point that I was badly making, was that David, because the Psalms are thought of as, or David is associated with the Psalter, then even in the Psalms that David has not written, we can still say that those are about, and sometimes the very words of the Messiah whom David pointed forward to. So take it for what it's worth. I think last week, I think everybody understood the point, and you were all good with it. And now this week I may have confused it more. So I hope that's not the case. I found this really interesting. I'll back up and show a few more slides. This may have been too small to see on the screen. Let's see, where am I? I'm over here. So this is from William Thayer's Greek lexicon. William Henry Thayer was a Greek grammarian, well-known, very well respected. This is a standard work. And he's talking about, as you can see, the first little red line up in the corner is the Greek preposition en, or in. This is where we get our word in. And it says in the yellow highlighted part that it is English. In English, we would translate this in, on, at, with, by, or among. But that's what this word means. So we're talking about the word in the phrase in David. And then he's going to go on and talk about it. If you look down here, D is, this word in is used of the contents of a writing or a book. He's going to give some examples, like this one. In the prophets is what it says. In the book of the prophets, Acts 13:40. Saying the preposition is sometimes used in that type of a phrase. And then he's going to say here in Romans 11:2, in that portion of scripture which treats of Elijah, in Elijah is the phrase. And then here, in David, in the Psalms of David. So he's saying that the phrase in David, which appears in Hebrews 4:7, is in the Psalms of David. But again, David didn't write the psalm that's being quoted. So it would be David as viewed as the, I don't know, author is the wrong word, but it's the only word I can think of, author of the Psalms.
He didn't write it, and it's not about him.
Right.
Is David being considered sort of like the collector of the Psalms?
No, because the Psalm,
Presenter of the Psalms?
no. He is
The manager.
So the Psalms, we have Psalms that are 500 years older than David. You know, the Psalm 90 is from Moses, but we have Psalms after David too that are about by 500 years. So David didn't have anything to do with collecting them. He is the author of the majority of the Psalms, but I think that his position, as in Samuel it says, he was the sweet singer of Israel. He is the one that who all of Israel associates their praise and worship and the Psalter with. And so so his name then becomes a name that is, since it's associated with the Psalter, it becomes a name for the Psalter. Anyway. Yeah, Steve.
Another word comes to mind, but I don't think that it would at all fit, would be to suggest that maybe David is the composer. So,
yeah, composer, author.
well, I mean, a composer with music is not the person. Oh, no, never mind. I was thinking of the wrong word.
Okay.
I was thinking of arranger.
Arranger.
The compiler?
Yeah,
No, not
someone who arranges something. So you take something that's already written, and then you make it your own by the way you arrange it.
Right. Yeah, except the final form of the Psalms is after the return from exile. So,
Okay.
yeah. So, Steve, you were going to say something?
I was trying to think of an analogy, and I have two comments. One is kind of think of an analogy of this, and maybe a bad one would be our Constitution.
Hmm.
So our Constitution had a date where it was authored, let's say, but now there are certain amendments, but we still refer to the Constitution with the amendments as our Constitution.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah. So, yeah, the just the simple point that I was making is that David is associated in such a way with the Psalms that to say in David is to say in the Psalter, and that has the theological ramifications that David, how is David speaking in the Psalms is applied then across the board to the Psalms. David is speaking as Israel's representative, Israel's king, as the ideal Israelite. And all of this points to Jesus. And so those are the points I was making. And I think that point was made last time when we just looked at the titles of the Psalter. So sorry to overkill.
one other thought.
Yeah.
The Blue Letter Bible has a schedule, and it says probable occasion when each psalm was composed.
Mm-hmm.
In scrolling through it, there's a collection which appears to be about 20 of the psalms that are described using these words. It says inserted toward the end of David's life. And that description, or that comment, is what is used on Psalm 95 as inserted towards the end of David's life. And of those Psalms where that phrase is used, they use a date, that they have a date here of 1015. There's about 20 of them.
Yeah. So 1015 would be about the time David's, when did he die? It was really close to that. Yeah, and so I did look at that actual webpage, and I copied it, put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and sorted it chronologically just so I could see it easier. But I want to make the comment that if you do a lot of research, by a lot I mean 10 minutes worth of research on the dating of the Psalms, you'll find that only about 30% of them you can date with any certainty, and the other ones have to be they're all guesses. And so it's admirable that this person or people have gone through and been able to do that, but they're more brave in their assessment than most other people. They'll just say, I really don't know.
Do you think they should have like plus or minus 50?
Plus or minus 100, plus or minus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
At least 50.
Yeah. I don't know. I would, I'm probably not going to in this lifetime look at every Psalm and try to date it. So I don't know how I'd approach the problem, but I know that even in massive commentaries where they have sections on date and occasion of the various Psalms, they often say we can't tell when this was written. It looks like it could be this, it could be that. Even Psalm 137 has a range, really. I think we can narrow it down, but a range between, say, 850 BC and 539, somewhere in there.
850. That would be extraordinary, wouldn't it?
A lot of people date it there because they think it has to do with Jeroboam or somebody, or So, yeah. So it's the art of dating is not. It's an art, not a science, and people come up with wide ranges, and I think a lot of the stuff in the Bible isn't meant to be tied down actually to a specific situation, because it's giving us a picture of the Messiah or general principles to live as his people and things that are timeless. But yeah, but it's a good starting place. It's a good place to where Steve has there on Blue Letter Bible.